you a picture that I had. The dogs in Texas are pretty resourceful. That's Otis the dog carrying a bag of dog food. I mean, if you got to evacuate and you're a dog, you might as well bring your food along. And somebody took a picture of the dog going down the road with his bag of dog food. And so God truly does take care of children, fools, and animals. And that's a picture of Otis. He's back home. He's all right. So, but even the dogs are resourceful in Texas. Well, today we are looking at Philemon, which is a letter that Paul wrote to Philemon. And there's several things in this letter that are very interesting and very helpful for us, and we're going to look at one aspect of it today. And so, Jesus, we know, always brought restoration or healing to broken lives. And just as the demon-impaired man of the Gadarenes was repaired, Paul follows Jesus' example in the renewal or the repairing of Onesimus. And so this sermon, this letter tells how broken people are made whole again, and the part that we play in the process of making broken people whole again. The fact is, hurting people are all around us. You know, those are people that we characterize as having hit rock bottom or having made a mistake that ends up on the 6 o'clock news or took a wrong turn. And their wrongdoing or sin can range from something minor to a great one. And it could be marital problems, it could be people that have lost their jobs, people that don't have a job or can't find the job that they want, others caught in an extramarital affair, or others that lie or cheat and get caught in an illegal or dishonest act. Others are hurting not because of something that they've done personally, but because circumstances change and they get caught in the crossfire. Still, others are hurt because they're hanging out with the wrong set of people. So the question is this morning, do you know any hurting people? The hurting are among spouses, kids, neighbors, friends, our leaders, and even people that we see out shopping or in the community. People at work, people in our families, people even in our church. There are hurting people. And so we need to realize as a church that there are hurting people all around us, both in the church and the community. The letter today, Paul's letter to Philemon, is a picture of a hurting person. The Apostle Paul wrote this letter, and it's a private letter, but it's included in the Bible because it gives us such a great picture of friendship. And in these 25 verses, it's one of the shortest books in the Bible, 25 verses, Paul shares his thoughts and he gives us some applications or some solutions about grace and forgiveness and acceptance. And this letter is about three people. Of course, Paul, the apostle, he wrote the letter. And some background, when he wrote this letter, he was a prisoner in Rome. The next one, of course, is Philemon. Paul writes the letter to Philemon. Philemon is a Christian slave owner who lived in the city of Colossae in Asia Minor, which today is present-day Turkey. And he is clearly a close friend of Paul. Chances are Paul personally led him to Christ. Now, we do know that he had a church that met in his house. And he was certainly a respected Christian leader. And then there is Onesimus. Onesimus is a runaway slave who came to Rome and meets up with Paul, who led him to Christ. And it's possible, though we don't know for certain, that he met Paul originally through his friendship with Philemon. And that's why he went looking for him in Rome. But in any case, we know Paul led Onesimus to Christ. He became a Christian, and he stayed in Rome serving Paul with thankfulness. And so here's the problem. Now Paul has this converted slave on his hands. What should he do? And Paul decides to send Onesimus back to Philemon, his master. But Onesimus is now a believer in Christ. He left as a rebel, as a criminal, and now he's returning as a fellow believer. And Paul wanted to make sure Philemon understood what had happened. That's why he wrote this letter. Now, before we continue, you may have heard the comments that the Bible supports slavery. And if you read this letter at first glance, yes, it does seem that the Bible supports slavery. But we need to know something about slavery in the first century. Now, slavery was occasionally practiced in Israel in the Old Testament times, but it was never widespread, and it was carefully regulated by Old Testament law. But by contrast, in New Testament times, the Roman Empire was built on slave labor. Every time the Romans conquered a new province, they added new slaves to the empire. And the scholars tell us that there were far more slaves in the times of Paul than there were Roman citizens. And it would not have been unusual for a rich man to own as many as 10,000 or 20,000 slaves. And to make a long story short, slavery was so commonplace and so accepted that no one thought seriously to oppose it. And that was one of the problems with our country during the Civil War, which ended up being a war. Now, Roman law provided little protection for slaves because they were regarded as property, not as people. And so owners could mistreat their slaves and even kill them with little or no legal retaliation. And the law specifically provided that owners could put runaway slaves to death, presumably as a warning to others. Yet, Paul sends Onesimus back to Philemon. Why? That's the central question of this book, this letter. How could he do that? Didn't Paul know that slavery was wrong in the eyes of God? And if he knew that, then why didn't he say that? These questions have troubled thoughtful Christians across the centuries. And as we look into these issues, we will discover that this book has an amazing relevance for our problems today. First of all, the letter reminds us of the greatness of Jesus. See, the letter reminds us that Christianity has the power to heal hurting hearts and put people back on their feet again. And you and I can be the link to that power. In other words, how do you and I love hurting people? Well, the first and immediate action for us is for us to be a friend. Being a friend has been described in many ways. A friend is someone who knows all about you and loves you anyways. A friend steps in when the world steps out. A friend is the one who never gets in the way except when you're on your way down. I like that one. A friend is one who never gets in the way except when you are on your way down. Because how else are you going to get back up without a friend helping you? And that's exactly what Paul was asking Philemon to do in reference to Onesimus. Philemon had been a friend to Paul, and we see that in this letter. Philemon chapter 1, verse 1. Paul to Philemon, our dear friend and co-worker. That's what Paul considered Philemon. And then he writes in verse 5, because I hear of your love and faith toward the Lord Jesus and for all the saints. And so now Paul asks Philemon to be a friend to Onesimus in verses 15 and 16. For perhaps this is why he was separated from you for a brief time, so that you might get him back permanently, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a dearly loved brother. He is especially so to me, but even more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. You know what happens with hurting people? Eventually people stop coming around. They adopt the out of mind, out of sight mindset. Which is why we need a prayer list to remind us to pray for hurting people. See, it's when people are at their worst or at their lowest, that is when they need love, acceptance, and encouragement the most. Yet it's often a time when the church fails. We need to change that. We need to come alongside people to encourage and support them. What does a friend do? A friend encourages and supports as much as possible. And Philemon had that gift. Paul says of him in verse 7, "For I have great joy and encouragement from your love, because the hearts of the saints have been refreshed through you, brother." The word refreshed means to give a break, relief from labor, or to give rest. It most commonly refers to the refreshment of the inner person. See, a friend comes alongside a hurting individual or a hurting person to offer support and encouragement. They help the stranger by assisting and comforting. They lighten the load of the burden they're carrying again and again. They bring refreshment like an ice-cold glass of water on a scorching hot day. They remind the wounded of the hope and love of God. In the movie The Color Purple, the character Sophie was thrown in jail for a relatively minor crime. And when she's released from prison, she's a broken woman who can barely function. And Sophie's mistress hands her a shopping list and says, "Go fill it." Well, the lead character, Celie, is a woman who has endured great pain, and she sees Sophie at the grocery shelves, and she's just staring there, and she understands that Sophie doesn't have a clue what to do and how to do it. And so she protects Sophie by quietly filling the grocery list order for her. And several months later, Sophie begins to waken from her deep trouble. And she says to the character, Miss Celie, she says, "I want to thank you for everything that you've done for me. I remember that day in the store. I was feeling really down. I was feeling mighty bad, and when I sees you, I know there is a God. I know there is a God. And one day I was going to go home, get to go home." See, that's the kind of refreshing friend that I want to be to the hurting people in my world. And so you and I need to be a friend. But also there are times when we must forgive. And that's something very much missing today. Have you ever noticed how we have this great ability as humans to recall old injustices, to dredge up insignificant insults and reopen old wounds? We tend to be unforgiving and not forgetting. And one would think that Christians would be better, that we would be a kinder and gentler tribe. A person who, having experienced the mercy and grace of God, can now pass that forgiveness on to others. But often that's not the case. And the reality is often summed up in this statement. Christianity is the only army that shoots its wounded. I mean, I'm sure you've heard that. Christianity is the only army that shoots its wounded. And Often the people with a wounded heart need a second chance to be forgiven. See, the gospel is the news, the good news of the second chance. To start over, to have a new beginning. Jonah, the one who disobeyed God, ran away, was given another chance. Peter, the one who denied Jesus, not once, not twice, 3 times, was later reinstated for the master's business. Paul, the one who attacked and persecuted the Christian community, was granted a new beginning to further the cause of Christ. And so now Paul is requesting of Philemon to grant Onesimus a second chance. In verse 12, I am sending him back to you as a part of myself. And then he says in verse 17, so if you consider me a partner, accept him as you would me. Onesimus has done something wrong. He made a mistake. He had committed a crime. But he deserved a second chance. You may have heard the name Roy Riegels from 1929. He played football for the University of California, and in the 1929 Rose Bowl, he picked up a fumble, he was spun around, and he started heading for the end zone. The wrong end zone. And he would have scored for the opponents, but he was tackled at the 1-yard line by a Georgia Tech player. And all of this happened right before halftime. And so at halftime, all of the California players went into the locker room, and they didn't say anything, and they sat on the benches, all except for Roy. He went off in the corner, and he just sagged and sat down in the corner, and he put his hands in his face, and he cried like a baby. And of course, coaches have a lot to say during intermission. Those of you that are soccer players know the coaches have a lot to say, though you don't get to go into the locker room. But they have a lot to say. Well, California coach Nibs Price was quiet. Finally, the timekeeper stuck his head in the dressing room and said, there's 3 minutes till playing time. And Coach Price looked at the team, and he glanced over at Riegels, and he said, men, the same team, the same players that played the first half will start the second. And all of the players quickly moved to the door except for Riegels. He didn't budge. And the coach looked at him again, and he called and he said, Riegels. And he still didn't move. And so Coach Price walked slowly over to the corner, and he looked down and he asked softly, he said, Roy, didn't you hear me? I said, the first team that started the first half will play the second. And Roy lifted his head, and his eyes were red and his cheeks were wet, and he says, Coach, I can't do it. I've ruined you. I've ruined the University of California. I've ruined myself. I couldn't face that stadium to save my life. And Coach Price reached out and he put his hand on the player's shoulder and said to him, Roy, get back up and go on back in the game. The game is only half over. And so Roy Riegels went back out onto the field, and the players of the opposing team said that they had never seen anyone play as hard as Roy did when he played the second half. And later on, he became a captain of the team and a successful Army soldier and a business owner, and he was inducted into the Rose Bowl Hall of Fame and the University of California Hall of Fame. And even Georgia Tech, believe it or not, invited him to their Hall of Fame celebration. And he'd never seen a film of that game until he saw it at Georgia Tech and realized what he had done wrong. But here's the point. Are you a forgiver? What does a forgiver do? A forgiver releases sin, releases mistakes. In other words, they let it go. They don't keep a record of wrong. They don't harbor grudges. They forget mistakes. They allow the other person to get on with their life. Forgiveness means to cancel a debt in order to provide an opportunity for repentance and reconciliation of a broken relationship. What Jesus did for us, we do for others. See, being a friend means we help the hurting one in the present. Being a forgiver means we wipe clean the slate of the past. But what about the future? Well, to love the hurting, we also need to remember forgiveness means another chance. It means we give people hope. We help to heal wounded hearts. We restore people's self-respect. Jesus did this with the woman at the well. And Onesimus was a runaway slave owned by Philemon who came to the company of Paul and as a result was converted to Christ. And now Paul is sending Onesimus back to Philemon, appealing to the acceptance and forgiveness of Christ for Onesimus. And Philemon had Onesimus' future in his hands. By law, he could have him executed. Or as a believer, he could restore him to a place of brotherhood and service. What would Philemon do? Now, the name Onesimus means useful. And Paul played on Onesimus' name by saying in verse 11, once he was useless to you, but now he is useful to both you and to me. See, Paul knew Onesimus had a great future, but that future was dependent on what Philemon would do. So what did Philemon do? We don't know. Sorry. I don't have a good ending to that story. We don't know what Philemon did to Onesimus. But we have a very good clue. Later on, one of the church fathers in the 2nd century named Ignatius, writing 50 years later in a letter to the Ephesians, addressed their wonderful minister, their bishop, by his name, Onesimus. And in the letter, Ignatius referred to Onesimus as the one who formerly was useless to you, but now he has become useful to both you and me. He uses the exact words that Paul uses. And Onesimus was probably not a common name. So we have a clue that something happened and something really good happened because of forgiveness. See, by forgiving, we give people their future back. And so what does a future giver do? A future giver restores one's spirit. Paul wrote to the Galatians in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Brothers, if someone is caught in any wrongdoing, you who are spiritual should restore such a person with a gentle spirit, watching out for yourselves so you also won't be tempted. And the word restored comes from the Greek meaning the mending of fishermen's nets in order to be used the next day. Because as they drag them across the bottom, they get caught on rocks and sticks and torn. And so the last thing the fishermen would do would repair their nets to make them ready for the next day. And so it means the idea of putting people back into a workable and useful shape. It reminds people that they are valuable to God and society. Jesus restored the woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery, the man with the withered hand, and the demon-possessed man. Jesus restores us who believe. When Thomas Edison was working on the first light bulb and improving it, he handed one of the finished bulbs to a young helper who was nervously carrying it upstairs step by step to the vacuum machine. As he got to the last step, he dropped the bulb, which, of course, broke. And consequently, the whole team had to work another 24 hours to create another light bulb. And so when Edison, after the 24 hours, when Edison looked around for somebody to carry the light bulb upstairs again, he gave it to the same boy. And that probably changed the boy's life. See, Edison knew that there was more than just a light bulb at stake. So who do you know who needs a friend? A second chance. A new future. For many hurting people, you will be the one who can turn their life around by offering them friendship, forgiveness, and a hope-filled future. The letter to Philemon reminds us that Christianity has the power to heal hurting hearts and to repair broken people, putting them back on their feet. And so it tells us that we are given the chance to participate in this revolutionary thing called grace and forgiveness, which leads to reconciliation. And so we can stop the cruelty and the hatred that we see all around us by doing for others what Paul asked Philemon to do for Onesimus. Amen. Our closing hymn, would you please stand? Number 143, Rejoice, the Lord is King. Number 143.